Hello. So, one, I guess, final video lecture for the year. It's one that I should have tackled earlier, but I think when you get to the final exam, you'll notice that this is prescient, to say the least. So, I want to talk about the new left. Tune in, drop out, take over. This, of course, is different from the counterculture and their saying, but again, this was what the new left was preaching. Tune in to the movement, drop out of school and society, take over, become the authority. So, again, this is the new left, the student movement, obviously much different from the counterculture. Individual leaders such as C. Wright Mills, Tom Hayden, Al Haber, Todd Gitlin. There are indeed hundreds of people that we could mention, men, women, white, African American, and we're going to touch upon a few of these people. But again, these are kind of four of the main names to recognize. Now, the main group surrounding the New Left was what was called the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. Now, what was this group about? They were against traditional liberal politics, but unlike the old left, they did not espouse Marxism. They were anti-corporate, anti-bureaucracy, anti-hierarchy. They showed disdain for mass culture, for what was the competitive ethic, for what they called plastic American civilization. Ultimately, they were disillusioned with American liberalism. Now, these were generally wealthier children. They came from wealthy families, often went to prestigious schools. Overall, they were college educated. This is important because it allowed them more leisure time to analyze, to study different ideas, and thus allowed for political idealism. Of course, if you're a working class person, you don't have time. You're working, you're coming home, taking care of the family, whatever. These students, again, wealthy, had time to kind of analyze different ideas and apply them to American society. But again, they are mostly liberal, like in the traditional sense. And their frustration, of course, comes from inactivity in certain issues, which we'll get to here in a bit. It is notable that the New Left was highly influenced by the Civil Rights Movement and their demonstrations. They would, for the most part, espouse civil disobedience. And of course, civil rights issues were at the core of what they saw as the problem with America, kind of unfulfilled promise, if you will. And they would work with many of these civil rights leaders, of course. So, but this is not a single issue movement, which we're going to get to here in a little bit. Politics for them was not seen as a way to affect policy, but as a means to achieving a moral society. So again, this is above and beyond simple legislation. It's about creating a moral society, one that interacts with everybody. They used direct action, again, less of a focus on electoral politics. They were detached from the Cold War. They very much viewed the blame for the Cold War on both sides. It was America's fault as well as the Soviet Union's fault, and certainly one could make a strong argument along those lines. Now, the major document that we see from the New Left, from the SDS, was the Port Huron Statement. And again, this was the manifesto of the New Left in the early 1960s. It emphasized, and I'm not going to get into this too deeply. This is a document that I would highly recommend reading just so you further understand it, but it is long, so be ready for it. It argued, it focused on democratic practices and democratic principles versus the actual practice of them. And this was a major criticism of the country. Again, this recognition that we practice democracy, we claim that we're free and equal, etc., but in reality, the practice showed something different. So they focused on the democratic principles and actually practicing them rather than marginalizing them. They believed that this lack of fulfillment of the American promise is what led to the spiritual misery among Americans. Now, the next term I'm going to mention is the key when we look at the New Left, and I would argue it's the key when we consider many of the movements in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that's the idea of participatory democracy. This, again, is at the core of the Port Huron Statement. It is at the core of SDS. What is participatory democracy? It's the idea that direct participation of everyone is necessary for a truly democratic society. Now, this is somewhat vague. The vagueness of the idea was intentional. Scholar James Miller, who we'll talk about later, argues that the movement wanted to spark discussion and not render anything permanent. They needed fluidity of ideas and action and leave the core ideas up for debate later. So again, when you see this, even though it's vague, you get an idea of what they mean. Direct participation of everyone is necessary for a truly democratic society. Now, obviously, we see that with the women's movement, the civil rights movement. We see it with AIM. We see it with Cesar Chavez. We see it with different groups. But again, this is the core, and you can decide for yourself or not whether we would end up practicing this over time. Now, to overcome the sense of alienation that they felt they believed they needed to focus on the individual in decentralizing communities. It was the responsibility of each individual to participate, they argued. And it was that individual who was to remain active in the community and beyond. Now, one example of how we see this try to be put into effect is the ERAP, E-R-A-P, the Economic Research and Action Project. Now, for this project, members of the New Left dropped out of school. They would live among the grassroots poor. This somewhat went against Port Huron because it stated that students were spiritually oppressed. Change would come through the universities while they were going, again, on kind of the front lines of American society, living and interacting with these people and trying to foment change that way. Now, the program called for direct action. Again, students working with the poor to create change. The poor, though, at the time were not looking to overthrow the government. They were not looking to attack corporate capitalism. They simply wanted jobs, they wanted food, and they wanted their garbage collected. That's part of a larger garbage strike, of course, that we talked about with 1968. But with, again, going back to what I mentioned about leisure, college students from wealthy families in the early 60s had time to read Marx, to read Weber, to read these different intellectuals. The working class didn't. Again, they were focused on more necessary items, more of the specifics that they needed to survive. And unfortunately, with the ERAP, many radicals were not willing to tough it out. By the end of the first summer in 1963, many would give up. They went home or they went back to campus. And this is one example of kind of the lack of unity within the movement. Port Huron was the manifesto, but their actions often contradicted this. Who were they trying to help? Were they trying to help themselves in their own spiritual misery? Were they trying to help the poor who had been disaffected, who had been marginalized? Were they trying to help African Americans who had obviously been marginalized throughout our history? Again, there's a lack of unity, kind of all these things combined, but at the same time, some of their claims went a different way. Gitlin, one of the noted members of the movement, and he was really one of the great writers about it as well, argued that ERAP, quote, was based on guilt. Again, these are rich white college students who feel bad. They feel guilty because of their position as juxtaposed to these others. Now, Gitlin's main book is Years of Hope, Days of Rage, about the New Left. And it is a very balanced treatment. He shows the weaknesses within the movement. He shows the fun that they had in the movement, but he does not sugarcoat anything. He points to the issues in America, how they were trying to deal with these, and how they failed in some ways, succeeded in others. Excellent book if you're curious about a first-hand account of the New Left. Another part of the SDS was their free speech movement. They held sit-ins, they held rallies on college campuses to promote free speech. Similar today, only it's kind of interesting because it's more about other groups who are demonstrating, not the left. But in any case, again, you can see if you look through history, some of these these actions you see on various campuses at Berkeley, at the Ivy League schools, et cetera. And again, it was about promoting free speech. Now, the anti-war movement, of course, was part of this, and they would be involved in the March on Washington in February 1965. But it's important to note, again, what, maybe we'll touch on this later, but if your movement is based on one idea, there are many weaknesses with that. Obviously, if you're an anti-war movement and the war ends, that's the end of the movement, right? So this was not necessarily a conscious attempt to just kind of keep that as only one part. I mean, that was a key part of what the New Left was trying to do, but it was one of many factors. Again, I would get back to the idea of participatory democracy. This was their goal. This is how they believed that the nation could change for the positive over the short and long term. And a lot of this comes into it. The anti war movement obviously would incorporate people's voices who were against the war: women, African Americans, Indians. Again, so many groups that are part of this. Now, as the decade wore on, of course, the movement would become a little bit more militant. We see increased marches, but we also see takeovers of buildings, especially on college campuses. We see shutdowns of buildings of different entities along college campuses, even within civil and civic institutions. They created what they called the Free University for radical instruction. They would embrace the ideas of Herbert Marcuse and the new Marxism and what they called the new working class. And this is where we get the idolization of like Che Guevara, a revolutionary who worked with Fidel Castro. Of course, they painted him in the best of terms when Che was, not exactly the type of person who wanted everybody to participate. And they were very much anti-imperialist. Again, part of this comes from Vietnam, part of it from the Cold War, and part of it the idea of let everybody kind of, create their own way within a larger movement, but focus on the United States and focus on American problems, not ignoring the problems of other countries, but if each country kind of practices this participatory democracy, these countries will all be able to filter out their problems. Now, I mentioned we have increasing espousal of violence as well. H. Rap Brown, a person I've mentioned before, he argued that if black radicals could use violence against imperialism, why couldn't white radicals? Brown's famous quote, do what John Brown did, pick up a gun and go out and shoot our enemy. Okay. Obviously not something Martin Luther King Jr. would have espoused, but now in 1967-68, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, would no longer be violent. They were now the Student National Coordinating Committee. And again, this was a group that focused on civil rights initially. But many of these individuals, such as Stokely Carmichael, would also be part of this new left, part of the student movement. But by this time, again, you kind of see more changes afloat. Folks like James Forman, Stokely Carmichael, again, and this discussion of a new alliance between the white student movement and black nationalists, and what they expected from white revolutionaries to make change. They expected a lot. Again, they expected them to be as active as they were. So you do see this coupling somewhat between black nationalists and the white student movement. Of course, over time, this would go away. Black nationalists focused on African Americans and believed African Americans should be at the core of their own change. This did not change the student movement, though, from actively working on civil rights issues. They created the Stop the Draft Week and would close down the Pentagon in October of 1967. Mark Rudd, of course, would lead the takeover of University of Columbia buildings. In the famous image, him in the president's chair smoking a cigar. And the new left, in some ways, became the old left. I mentioned early on they did not espouse Marxism, but later, of course, over time they would. And they, again, folks like Marx, I mentioned Marcuse earlier, some of these more radical, the playwright Bertolt Brecht, these are people who their ideas they began to espouse, they became more radical and increasingly influenced by Marx and new Marxism. Of course, one of the main efforts that we see even beyond ERAP, beyond the free speech movement, was their activity in 1968 at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. I've gone over that in a different video lecture. I won't go over it again here. But again, part of this was certainly about demonstrating against the war, but it was a much bigger issue. They were looking at larger structural changes in American society, and they believed that they could gain attention by doing that. And of course, my thoughts, you have to gain publicity for your issue if you want any kind of movement, any kind of progress. Now, the student movement would also ally with the Black Panthers. Some of these Panthers would be involved in 68 and, of course, be part of the Chicago 7 trial. And we see the Weathermen. Now, the Weathermen were the most violent of the student movement groups. Many of these people were actually no longer students by the time they joined it. Some of these folks would actually espouse Charles Manson and his tactics for gaining attention. They espoused the idea of bombing locations, and they would bomb some. They went to Cuba. They met with representatives of the Viet Cong and the Cuban government at different times. Of course, if you're familiar with Jane Fonda, the fact that she was paraded in front of American prisoners of war in Vietnam, and the prisoners of war were required to apologize to her for the war. So Fonda, definitely part of this new left, and definitely not a face in a positive way. And she's faced a lot of criticism over the years, and deservedly so. So again, they go to Cuba, they meet with representatives of the Viet Cong, they outwardly espouse the Viet Cong, cheer for North Vietnamese victory. They robbed the National Armory. They robbed banks. There was a sniper attack on a police station. They bombed police cars. They firebombed a judge's house. They would bomb the U.S. Capitol. They bombed the Pentagon. They bombed the State Department. Each of these was in response to a specific escalation of the war in Vietnam. They even bombed the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, that's, ironic, hypocritical, however you want to look at it. Eventually, many of these folks would turn themselves in 1976. The government would actually drop several cases because they had illegal wiretaps, because of the sources they used, because of the methods that they used to obtain much of this information. Some would come out and ask fellow weathermen to reemerge, to engage the change at the community level rather than hide and remain radical. Some would move to South America. Some went into hiding in the United States. Again, some would come out and begin to, try to continue to effect change. Now, I had mentioned the weathermen in a previous video. Bob Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues, his lyric, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." That is what gave the group their moniker. Now, why did the student movement ultimately fail? If you want to think that they failed, let's look at it in this way. They were very active for about a decade and a half, then they kind of fell off. Some of these activists would turn conservative, would become lawyers, would become politicians. Some remain liberal, would become lawyers, would become politicians, other professionals. You have folks like Gitlin, who is still quite active today for various radical causes. But this group kind of went different ways. And, the cohesion of the student movement, again, it wasn't that unified, but there was a specific movement. They had many goals together. They worked together in some ways. And for some of them, it was just coming of age. They start when they're 19, 20 years old. They've got a lot to say, a lot to do. By the time they're in their mid-30s, they have other priorities. So this is, this is kind of a natural evolution. But I always kind of touch upon why did this group kind of go away, what led to its failure. One issue, one example would be government repression. The government, of course, made sure that those who were most radical could limit the damage done by these people. Again, you can see the arrests of the weathermen of various people over time. The Chicago 7 after the Democratic Convention, of course. De-escalation of Vietnam also played a role. This was the main complaint of many. Again, not everybody wanted some type of grand structural change, but the war did have a direct impact on these students. Part of this, of course, was the draft. For young men who were 18, 19 years old, they could be drafted into a war they did not believe in, and they would be forced to go fight. Now, if they perceived that they had less to worry about with regard to the war, why continue to protest? Why risk arrest? Why risk violence at the hands of the police or various officials? So, and again, the war is not the only reason. It's only one part of the student movement. But for some, it's why they glob on. It's why they join the movement. They see the war as unjust. And again, there's a lot of self-preservation involved here. I don't want the war to go on because I don't want to be drafted. Completely legitimate. So, with this group, again, even though the war doesn't dominate the new left, once we see de-escalation in the war, it does impact the power of the movement. The increasing militants, which I've talked about, the increasing violence led to a loss of moral authority for many average Americans. The idea that these rich kids were bombing the Pentagon did not rub them the right way. And of course, if you are looking to reach out to the working classes to increase this participatory democracy and you alienate these groups, it only hurts your movement. Another issue that many historians point to is the inability to find off-campus allies. Now, part of this had something to do with the vagueness of their ideals, of their statements, etc. African Americans, of course, had their own movement. They had the civil rights movement, they had black power, they had black nationalism. So even though they were part of this, they very much were splintered. They had their own priorities. The working class, again, was more concerned with feeding their families than they were with structural change. Women had their own movement. They were often marginalized by those in the movement, which we'll get to in a little bit. They were marginalized by many in the student movement, and many who did not go to college simply did not have time to sit around and think about the nation's problems and how to solve them. They had to work and earn money to support themselves. So again, if you're looking at rich kids on college campuses, hey, that's fertile. But there's other groups that were maybe not reached out to, but whose issues didn't really relate to the student movement either. So as much as they fostered this idea of participatory democracy, of course, there was only so far they could go within their own movement. As some historians have pointed to, the New Left had a commitment to revolution in a non-revolutionary situation. Let's face it, things weren't that bad for Todd Gitlin, for Tom Hayden. They lived good lives. There was a failure to fashion a cogent ideology for American radicalism, possibly because there was never a solution for this ideological problem. Again, there are many ways to look at this, but I mentioned they have key ideas. They have the Port Huron Statement. They have specific movements that they're trying to lead. But at the same time, there is kind of a lack of unity. I've mentioned these various groups that are kind of involved and kind of not. And the vagueness of the Port Huron Statement did not provide a specific ideal for people to strive toward. Matusow, of course, my favorite historian of the 60s, argued, quote, their critique was more aesthetic than political. Few could long sustain a self-image as technology's slaves impoverished by abundance. And to be sure, again, this gets back to the idea that these were generally wealthy people or middle-class people at the very least who were enjoying college education, who were enjoying abundance of the 1950s and the 1960s. And, you know, how bad was it for them? I like the use technology slaves by Matusow. Of course, the Unabomber would also use that terminology. In the end, did the New Left simply fail because things weren't that bad for them? Or maybe things weren't that bad for America itself? Was revolution truly the answer? I think that's the main question. Now, again, the anti-war section, the war part, obviously legitimate, but again, these larger issues that the New Left pushed were very much tertiary to many Americans. Another conclusion Matusow allows is the moral outrage, not the self-liberation, was fuel to their radicalism. They were disillusioned with liberalism, and this came out in their own moral outrage. That it was not necessarily about self-liberation. I mentioned James Miller before in a scholar. His work, Democracy in the Streets, From Port Huron to the Siege of Chicago, focuses specifically on the New Left. What started as a revolution ended as reform, according to Miller. He argued that participatory democracy did reverberate because of new importance and recognition of single-issue movements, such as women's liberation, African American dignity, homosexual rights, the anti-war movement, environmentalism. I talked about AIM. Look at Cesar Chavez and his work with migration or with migrant workers. So Miller again makes this argument that, look, maybe they didn't initiate a revolution and maybe things ended in reform, which again just goes right back to liberal politics, which they were not about. But the idea of participatory democracy did reverberate. It did bring more recognition of these various groups and the issues that they had. Now, getting back Todd Gitlin, his work again, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, a first-person account. He argued this was a time of great hope, but it was also one of anger. Students felt that they could make a difference in the world, but as this occurred slowly, frustration began to set in. This led to diverging units of the New Left, some supporting violence while others supported peace. We have inherent contradictions, which limited their success. The methodology is explained above, but also that students wanted to change the world, but still sought immediate freedoms and gratification. How to incorporate those in the counterculture who sought to tune in rather than, as Jerry Rubin said, to tune in, drop out, and take over. Again, a lot of various angles here that Gitlin's looking at. But the one statement I want to go back to, they wanted to change the world, but they still sought immediate freedoms and gratification. Now, the New Left was not this group of stuffy college students who never wanted to have fun. They did drugs, they drank, they were involved in promiscuous sex, they did all kinds of crazy stuff. But that doesn't, again, really reflect the stated goals of the Port Huron Statement or of the movement. So even though they wanted this change, they still wanted to, live in the 1960s. um, Again, one of the terms I like that Gitlin uses is that they promoted hip collectivity, while they also maintained the standing of the individual. So again, there's this focus on the whole as the collective, but there's also the emphasis on the individual. The individual creates this collective change, but still this focus on the collective. There were limited successes and a sense of disappointment over how things would turn out. Now, another work, Maurice Eiserman and Michael Kazin, their work America Divided, which calls the 1960s the Second Civil War. The New Left did not affect immediate, grandiose change, according to Eiserman and Kazin, but they did have a large impact on the post-1960s. There was no more complacency with regard to political questions. They broadened the populist critique to include culture as well as economic and political power structures, and it was a general move to the left for Democrats. And certainly you could see this. You go back to 1960, the election of John Kennedy, a Cold Warrior, a liberal, a Democrat to be sure. I mean, he was a Catholic in Boston, right? But he was also quite conservative. I mean, we talked about 1960, the key issues in that election, both candidates agreed on quite a bit. Johnson, of course, would be much more active. And when we get to the end of the 60s, Democrat kind of takes on a new meaning. You see this with McGovern, with Eugene McCarthy, and you'll see it very much, later, a few decades later. One of the other things that they emphasize, and this is a constant theme when we look at the 1960s and the New Left, change was more personal than political. Now, that gets us to, I want to talk a little bit about the women's movement and making the personal political. And this alludes to a book entitled Personal Politics by Sarah Evans, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But the personal politics, the influence of the civil rights movement and the student movement on women and their desire to agitate for change, all this came together. This came to a head in the 1960s. And this is why the women's movement would become particularly empowered at this time, because of these other movements and women's involvement in these movements. Now, I'm not saying that they needed these movements necessarily to foment change, but this is what gave them experience. It gave them recognition of the fact that they needed to work for their own rights as well. And a lot of it had to do with the treatment in both of these organizations, especially when you look at the more radical side of the Black Power movement. They very much marginalized women. Women were required, hey, you go get the coffee. Right? I'm not worried about your ideas. You take care of that. Oh, and, lay down with me. These are things that we see not only with Black Power, but we see it with the student movement as well. And this is something that Evans goes through in her work, Personal Politics. She very much emphasizes how these more radical students, even though they were calling for all this great change and real liberation, were still treating women as if they were sex objects, as if they had requirements. Again, get me the coffee, clean up the room when we're done, this and that. So, again, quite hypocritical if you look at it in that way. So, Evans finds the roots of the modern feminist movement in the role played specifically by Southern women in the civil rights movement and later the New Left. The civil rights movement participation showed their plight was similar to that of African Americans. It provided experience for organizing and conducting direct action. One example, in SNCC, women played a key role in the movement, organizing individuals, sacrificing their well-being as much as any of the men, yet they were still marginalized. As the movement veered away from nonviolence toward black nationalism, the role of whites was limited, and white women particularly moved on. There was also significant sexual tension, Evans talks about, between black women and white women. Relationships of white women with black men in the movement was seen as, quote, a barrier that shared womanhood could not transcend. Thus, race took precedence over gender in some of these situations. Now, with the New Left, again, they organized actions. They took part in demonstrations. They were key parts in this. They developed key programs in communities across the nation. They played a vital role in SDS and ERAP. Their experience in the New Left, though, only exacerbated the frustration that the civil rights movement had created. Their treatment at the hands of male leaders perpetuated the sense of otherness that they had always felt. The idea of the other against Simone de Beauvoir, the core of feminism in her book, The Second Sex, lays all this out. The idea that, again, these women are defined as the other. They're not defined in their own way as their own individuals. They are defined in this case as, the people who go get us coffee, the people who write the signs. They don't come up with the ideas for the signs, that type of thing. In larger society, of course, women portrayed They're the wife, they're the mother, they're the sister, they're the daughter. They're not their own person. That's what Simone de Beauvoir was talking about. And again, this is what Evans clarifies in her work. They were known as the spouses of the male leaders, for example. They were sexually exploited quite often by New Left members. They were required to maintain their domestic roles at New Left gatherings in general. Now, the irony, the movements in which women played such an important role, movements based on egalitarianism, on freedom, on human dignity, had marginalized them and made them the other. Now, from this conclusion, Evans argues feminism was born. Again, this is significant irony, or you could call it, hypocrisy, either one. But the idea that these movements were about, again, liberation in general, yet it denied liberation of women. As Evans argues, only by making these personal issues into political issues could true change be fostered and the inequities of American society truly recognized. Recognition of what is important to us personally must be converted to a political realm to make that true impact. These were personal issues for these individuals. They were made political by those who dared to raise their voices. Now, by the 1970s, disparate groups of women were taking part in this call for equality of power. Young radicals and housewives, lesbians and church leaders, blacks and whites, all women, all across the spectrum. No longer was feminism on the periphery of American society. It was now recognized as a mainstream quest for real justice. Evans claims, quote, sisterhood holds the potential to transform the future, but personal politics demonstrates sisterhood has also changed our history. Now, consciousness developed in many ways. Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique made an impact, but more importantly, for many of these women was participation in these movements and the treatment that they experienced. They developed a sense of togetherness, more importantly, an understanding that they must act on their own behalf, and they formed a sense of community. Certainly there were divisions between heterosexual and lesbian women. There were divisions between African American and white women. There were divisions between upper class women and working class women. They kind of had different needs sometimes, but they came together again very much and fomented change in significant ways. It starts with works like The Feminist Mystique or now these groups. But again, according to Evans, and you see this in the civil rights movement as well, you make the personal political.